Well, I'm talking about Revolt against the classical tradition. The second half of the 18th century marks the beginning of the Romantic movement in literature. During this period, there was a revolt against the Augustan tradition, which may be conveniently studied under the following heads. First is a return to nature, to real nature and contrasted with the conventional bookish nature of the artificial pastoral. In spite of the exception like Lady Winchelsea and Thomas Parnell, through whose poetry a breath of fresh air seems to blow from the countryside, it may be generally said of the poetry of the earlier decades of the 18th century that it dealt with town life and was deficient in any genuine feeling for nature. The poetry of natural descriptions begins quite early in the century in The Gentle Shepherd, 1725 of Alan Ramsay. The love of nature is quite a conspicuous feature, and the poem reminds us pleasantly that his idea of a pastoral differed considerably from that of Pope, the reigning poet. Dyer's delicate Granger Hill in 1726 contains exquisite landscape drawing and has a suite of allegro movement and reminds us of Milton. In the same year, 1726 was published the first book of Thomson's Seasons, the first great poem of natural description. The poem reveals that its author was an extremely careful observer of nature and it abounds in description of nature which possesses a photographic accuracy. There are passages in seasons, as for instance, the description of Lavinia's autumn, which seems to foreshadow, although vaguely and distantly, the poetry of Wordsworth himself. Only in his use of the artificial poetic diction does Thomson betray his kinship with the school of Pope. From this time on, the love of nature becomes increasingly prominent in English poetry. It is present in Gray and Collins, Black and Burns, and reaches its heights in the poetry of Cowper, who in his attitude to nature comes nearest to the Wordsworthian spirit. Cowper's poetry reveals an intimate knowledge and love of nature, although, as Hazlitt said, he seems to shake hands with nature with his gloves on. The development of naturalism, that is, the growth of the naturalistic tendency in poetry, may be considered as a part of the general return to nature movement. The naturalistic movement emphasized the current contrast which exists between nature and civilization and put its faith in the elemental simplicities of human life. It viewed with great suspicion and conventions of society which it believed had a cramping effect on the development of the individual. Its first conviction was that the only way to happiness lay through a radical simplification of life. This resulted in poetry, says Hudson. In the quest for more elementary themes, which of course had to be sought among the unsophisticated country folk rather than amid the complexities of the recognized centers of culture and refinement, and for more natural modes of treatment. Great simplicity in the subject matter chosen, in the passion described, and in the language employed, but thus among the principal objects aimed at by many poets of the new generations. This therefore marked a reaction against the conventional themes handled by Popian schools as well as against the artificial, stilted diction consistently employed by them. The reaction was aided by the revival of the old ballad literature, which was taking place about the same time. The naturalistic kind of poetry reached its perfection in the hands of Wordsworth, but William Blake may be looked upon as a leader in the kind. Blake's later poetry is symbolic and mystical and often unintelligible, but the delightful lyrics contained in his earlier volumes of verse, poetical sketches, songs of innocence, and songs of experience reveal him as the lover of the country, of simple life, of childhood and home. Blake's style in these early poems is simplicity itself, and he concedes nothing to the poetic diction of the classical school. Blake, in most respects, a romantic poet and a contemporary of the poets of romantic revival, George Crabbe exemplifies another and contrasted phase of naturalism. His works, like The Village, The Borough, and The Parish Register, are marked by an uncompromisingly realism and enveloped by an all pervading gloom which the poet never relieves with the help of an idealizing touch. Crabbe had an intimate knowledge of the life of the poor with its sordidness and misery, and he describes it in words with a sympathy and sincerity. Unlike Blake, however, Crabbe belongs in most other respects to the school of the Pope.